Beneath a parking lot in Leicester, under painted lines and ordinary asphalt, lay the bones of a king. Not a legend, not a rumor. A real body folded into the earth for more than 500 years. Above him, cars came and went. People walked past with shopping bags, keys, coffee cups. No reason to suspect that one of England's most controversial monarchs was lying just beneath their feet. Richard III had not merely died. He had vanished into the modern city, and somehow history had parked on top of him. To understand how that could happen, we have to slow down. Because this is not only a story about a skeleton being found. It is a story about reputation, defeat, memory, and the strange way the ground sometimes keeps a better record than the people who write history. Leicester's parking lot looked painfully ordinary. That is part of what makes the discovery so unsettling. There was no royal marker, no grand tomb, no carved warning that a dynasty had ended here in silence. Just tarmac, brick walls, and the practical clutter of a working city. Yet beneath that everyday surface was a question England had carried for centuries. Where was Richard III? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. For generations, Richard lived more vividly as a villain than as a man. His body was missing, but his image was everywhere. Twisted by politics, sharpened by theater, repeated until the performance became almost easier to believe than the person. Then, in 2012, the asphalt was opened. The city gave up its secret, and the bones beneath the parking lines forced the legend to answer to something colder, quieter, and harder to ignore. Evidence. Chapter 2. A king turned into a villain. Before Richard III was rediscovered as bones, he survived as an image. A small, dark figure, a crooked back, a restless mind. A crown taken with blood on the hands. In the popular imagination, Richard did not simply rule England. He crept through it. He became the king who smiled while plotting, the uncle who could not be trusted, the tyrant whose body seemed to announce the corruption of his soul. That is the Richard many people met first, not in a document from his own lifetime, not in a battlefield report, not in the practical records of government, land, loyalty, and war. They met him on a stage. Shakespeare's Richard enters the world already explaining himself, already inviting the audience into his private bitterness. He is clever, theatrical, dangerous, almost charming in the way a knife can be beautiful if the light catches it correctly. And because Shakespeare understood drama better than most historians ever will, that version endured. It moved easily from theater into memory. It gave people a Richard they could picture. The problem is that a picture can become a prison. For centuries, Richard III was remembered less as a complicated 15th century ruler and more as a moral shape. His physical form was made to carry his reputation. His curved body, exaggerated in later telling, became evidence of a curved soul. His ambition became monstrous. His suspicion became proof. His enemies did not merely defeat him. They helped define what he would mean. That matters because Richard's story sits at the uncomfortable meeting point between history and storytelling. History wants evidence, context, patience. Storytelling wants a face, a motive, a villain who can be recognized from the back row. Richard gave later writers, especially those writing under the Tudors, something incredibly useful: a defeated king whose fall could be made to look inevitable. If Richard was a monster, then his defeat was not just a political victory, it was a cleansing. And that idea served the new dynasty very well. Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, did not inherit the throne in a calm, uncontested ceremony blessed by universal agreement. He won it in battle. His claim was not simple. His position needed strengthening. One of the oldest ways to make a new regime look lawful is to make the old one look diseased. The darker Richard became, the brighter the Tudor sunrise could appear. This does not mean every accusation against Richard was invented from nothing. That would be too easy and too neat. He lived in a brutal political world. He took power in a moment of crisis. 2 young princes disappeared under his rule, and that disappearance will always cast a long shadow over his name. Suspicion did not appear out of thin air, but suspicion is not the same as certainty. Over time, the difference between what was known, what was suspected, and what was useful to believe began to blur. Richard's reputation hardened. Later chroniclers added shape and color. Shakespeare gave it a voice. Audiences remembered the voice, and so the man became smaller than the legend built around him. There is something strangely efficient about this kind of historical transformation. A living person is inconvenient. He has contradictions. He makes decisions under pressure. He belongs to a world that does not explain itself easily to later centuries. But a villain is tidy. A villain can be placed at the center of a story and made responsible for its darkness. Richard III became that kind of figure. He became the answer before the questions were fully asked. Why did the Wars of the Roses end in such exhaustion? Richard. Why did the princes vanish? Richard. Why did the Tudor dynasty deserve to begin? Because Richard had to be removed. The explanation was dramatic, memorable, and politically useful. That does not automatically make it false, but it should make us careful. The real Richard was born into a family where power was never secure, and loyalty could be a temporary arrangement. He grew up in a country where noble names were tied to armies, where royal blood could protect a person one year and endanger him the next. He was not created by Shakespeare's imagination. He was created by civil war. Yet the legend often skips that. It prefers to begin with the monster fully formed. That is one reason the discovery beneath the Leicester parking lot was so powerful. It did not simply locate a missing grave. It interrupted a performance that had been running for centuries. The skeleton did not speak in Richard's defense. Bones do not clear a man of political suspicion. They do not explain missing children or repair the violence of a reign, but they do force a pause. They remind us that beneath the villain was a body, not an emblem, not a stage device, a human body marked by illness, battle, and death, a body that belonged to a man who had been praised, feared, served, betrayed, accused, mocked, and finally buried with little ceremony. The danger, of course, is that modern sympathy can become its own distortion. It is tempting to swing too far the other way, to rescue Richard so completely from Tudor propaganda that he becomes a misunderstood hero with every stain washed away. That is another kind of theater. The point is not to replace the black mask with a white one. The point is to notice the mask. Richard III's afterlife shows how power continues after death. A king can lose his throne, his battle, his body, even the location of his grave. but the story told about him can keep ruling in his place. For Richard, that story was sharp enough to survive the Reformation, the loss of Greyfriars, the rebuilding of Leicester, the centuries of traffic above his grave. Long before archaeologists found him under asphalt, he had already been buried once before, beneath a character so famous that the man himself became almost unreachable. And to understand how that happened, we have to step back from the stage, away from the painted villain, and into the violent family struggle that shaped him before he ever wore the crown. Chapter 3: The House of York's Last Hope. Richard did not enter history as a king. He entered it as a younger son in a family that had already learned to measure life in alliances, inheritances, and sudden reversals. To understand him only from the throne is to begin too late. By the time Richard III became the name everyone argued over, Richard of Gloucester had already spent most of his life inside the machinery of the Wars of the Roses, a conflict where family loyalty was not a private virtue, but a political weapon. He was born into the House of York, one branch of the Plantagenet family, at a time when England's crown had become something less stable than it looked. Kingship was supposed to suggest order, ceremony, law, lineage, the golden shape of continuity. But beneath that surface, royal blood had become crowded with competing claims. Cousins could become rivals, brothers could become liabilities. A noble household could be a fortress one season and a target the next. For a younger son like Richard, the lesson would have been plain enough. Survival depended on knowing where power stood and standing close to it. His older brother Edward understood power with uncommon force. Edward IV was tall, charismatic, militarily successful, and when fortune favored him, almost dazzlingly effective. He became the Yorkist answer to Lancastrian rule, the man who could turn a dynastic claim into a crown. Richard's early importance came through him. He was Edward's brother, Edward's supporter, Edward's trusted man in the north. That loyalty is worth pausing over, because it complicates the later portrait of Richard as a creature made only of appetite. For much of his adult life, Richard was not plotting to take the throne. He was helping his brother keep it. That does not make him gentle. It does not make him innocent. 15th century loyalty could be hard-edged, armed, and unforgiving. But it does remind us that Richard's career did not begin with the murderously ambitious figure later audiences came to expect. It began with service within a dynasty fighting to hold itself together. The north of England became central to that identity. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, built much of his authority there. He was not merely a court figure drifting through palace corridors. He governed, commanded, rewarded followers, and cultivated support among northern families whose loyalty mattered deeply. In that world, power was personal. It was not enough to possess a title on parchment. Men had to believe that your favor was useful, your anger serious, and your protection worth having. Richard seems to have understood that. His reputation in the north was not simply the reputation of a prince. It was the reputation of a lord who had to make rule feel real across distance, terrain, and local interests. He became associated with order, military competence, and firm government. These are not glamorous qualities in a legend. They do not make a memorable villain, but they help explain why some people followed him and why his later seizure of power cannot be understood only as a theatrical lunge for a crown. The Wars of the Roses trained men to think in terms of risk. A child's legitimacy could decide the future of a kingdom. A marriage could rearrange loyalties. A battle could end an argument. or merely postpone it until the sons of the defeated were old enough to continue. Political life was not a chessboard so much as a family table where every seat had a knife beneath it. Richard grew up in that atmosphere. The point is not to excuse him with context. Context is not a pardon, but without it, he becomes too simple. And Richard III has suffered, perhaps more than most English kings, from being made simple. He was shaped by a culture where mercy and ruthlessness were not opposites in the way modern viewers might expect. A ruler could be pious and violent, generous and calculating, loyal to one person and merciless to another. The same man might endow religious institutions, protect local rights, and order political enemies removed. The 15th century did not require its powerful men to fit neatly into moral categories. Later storytelling often does. Richard's loyalty to Edward IV was one of the pillars of his public life. When Edward's reign faced rebellion, shifting noble support, and the return of old enemies, Richard remained closely tied to him. He benefited from Edward's trust, and Edward benefited from Richard's usefulness. This relationship placed Richard near the center of Yorkist authority, but not at its summit. He stood beside the throne, not on it, and that position mattered. A younger brother of the king could be both valuable and dangerous. Valuable because royal blood gave him authority no ordinary noble could match. Dangerous because that same blood made him a possible alternative if the line of succession faltered. Richard's life before 1483 was therefore full of attention that may not have seemed urgent while Edward lived. He was close enough to power to defend it, and close enough to inherit suspicion if anything went wrong. Then Edward IV died. The death of a strong king is rarely just a private loss. In a fragile political system, it is an earthquake. What had looked solid under Edward suddenly had to prove it could stand without him. His heir, Edward V, was still a boy. The Woodville family, connected to Edward IV's queen, held influence. Richard, as the king's brother and a leading royal duke, had his own authority and expectations. In theory, the transition could be managed through law, guardianship, and ceremony. But theory has a calmness history seldom respects. Richard's earlier life now became part of the danger. His loyalty to Edward IV gave him a claim to protect Edward's legacy. His northern power gave him men and confidence. His royal blood gave him proximity to the crown. His military background gave him credibility in a kingdom that still remembered how quickly politics could become armed. What happened after Edward's death would become one of the most disputed passages in English history, but it did not emerge from nowhere. It came from a world where the crown had been contested before, where noble factions watched each other carefully, and where a child king could be less a symbol of continuity than an invitation to struggle. Richard was not yet the villain of the play. He was not yet the skeleton beneath Leicester. He was a powerful royal uncle in a dangerous transition, carrying years of loyalty, ambition, grievance, and political training into a moment when every decision could be interpreted two ways: as protection or as preparation. And between those two possibilities, the tragedy of Richard III began to take its most enduring shape. Chapter 4: The Princes in the Tower. The story darkens around two boys. That is one reason it has never settled. Political murders can become abstract with time. Battles turn into maps. Claims to the throne become lines in a family tree. But the disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, resists that kind of distance. They were children. They were royal children. and they vanished while the man who benefited most from their removal was preparing to become king. That is the shape of the accusation, simple enough to remember, dangerous enough to survive. After Edward IV died, his eldest son was expected to become Edward V. He was not yet old enough to rule independently, but that was not unusual. England had known minority kings before, and the machinery of guardianship, councils, and noble management could, at least in theory, carry a child to maturity. The problem was never only the boy's age. It was the men around him. Power gathered around a child king does not become innocent because the child is innocent. Edward V represented continuity, but he also represented access. Whoever controlled the young king could influence appointments, favors, policy, and the future shape of the realm. His mother's Woodville relatives had reason to protect their position. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had reason to fear being sidelined. Others watched for advantage, or simply for survival. England had not forgotten how quickly royal politics could become a contest of armed households. Edward V was taken to the Tower of London. To modern ears, that sounds almost automatically sinister. The Tower has become a symbol of imprisonment, execution, and state fear. But in 1483, it was also a royal residence and a traditional place where monarchs prepared for coronation. A young king staying there before being crowned was not, by itself, proof of a crime. This is where careful history has to resist the easy chill of hindsight. At first, the Tower did not mean disappearance. It meant anticipation. A coronation was expected. Plans moved forward. The city waited for the formal transformation of a boy into a king. Then the rhythm changed. The coronation was delayed. Richard's authority grew. The boy's younger brother joined him in the Tower. The two princes were seen less often. Then, at some point, they were not seen publicly at all. Here the evidence thins in precisely the place we most want it to become solid. There is no surviving confession from Richard. No body was conclusively identified at the time. No official record neatly announces what happened to the children. Later accounts point toward murder, and many people then and since believed Richard was responsible, directly or indirectly. The suspicion is not careless. It rests on motive, opportunity, political consequence, and the brutal logic of the moment. But motive and opportunity are not the same as proof. That distinction matters, not because Richard must be protected from suspicion, but because the princes deserve better than being used as props in a story already decided. Their disappearance became the great moral engine of Richard's black legend. Once they were believed dead, every other action of his could be read backward through that darkness. His coronation became theft. His governance became tyranny. His body became a symbol. His enemies did not need to solve the crime completely in order to use it. The missing boys became more powerful in absence than they had been in life. What can be said with more confidence is that their removal from public view changed everything. A living Edward V was a problem for Richard's kingship. Even if Richard believed, or claimed, that Edward IV's children were illegitimate, the boy still carried immense symbolic force. People had expected him to be king. His face, his name, his bloodline, and the memory of his father could gather opposition simply by existing. A vanished prince is not politically neutral. If the boys were alive, they could become rallying points. If they were dead, their deaths could become a curse on the regime. Either way, Richard's rule was trapped by them. This is one of the central tragedies of his reign. The very act that appeared to clear the path to power, whether ordered by him or merely allowed to happen under him, left behind a question too poisonous to bury. Some historians have looked for alternative suspects. The late 15th century had no shortage of men who might benefit from confusion, weakened legitimacy, or a Yorkist line damaged beyond repair. Henry Tudor's later victory encouraged its own questions. Others point to figures closer to the court, to factional rivalries, to the possibility that Richard may not have personally ordered what later generations assumed he ordered. These arguments matter, but they must be handled cautiously. The existence of alternative suspects does not erase Richard's responsibility for what happened under his authority. By the time the princes disappeared, he was the dominant political figure in their world. They were in royal custody. Their safety was not a minor detail. It was the center of the kingdom's future. And the kingdom noticed. Rumor does not need a printing press to travel. In a city like London, silence itself can become news. A coronation delayed, a child moved, a public appearance withheld, a whisper from a servant, a noble suddenly uncertain where to place his loyalty. These fragments can combine into a political weather system. People may not know the facts, but they can feel the pressure change. Richard's problem was that he could not produce the boys. If they were alive, where were they? If they were dead, why and by whose order? If they had been removed for their own safety, why did reassurance never arrive in a form strong enough to quiet suspicion? A ruler can survive many accusations when he controls the facts. Richard faced something worse, an absence that seemed to accuse him every time it was mentioned. That absence gave later writers extraordinary power. They could imagine the scene the records did not preserve. They could place fear in the tower, footsteps in the night, orders carried out behind locked doors. Shakespeare, writing long after the events, turned the disappearance into moral theater. The crime became intimate, almost visual. The audience did not need archival certainty. It felt the story. And feeling often outlives documentation. Yet the real mystery is not only whether Richard ordered the deaths of the princes, it is how a political crisis became a permanent stain. Many medieval rulers acted ruthlessly. Many heirs were removed, imprisoned, or destroyed in struggles for succession. But the princes in the tower possessed a haunting clarity. 2 children, a fortress, a crown, and then nothing. No funeral the public could trust. No grave the kingdom could gather around. No explanation that satisfied memory. That is why the story has endured. It is not just a question of guilt. It is a question of legitimacy. A king who comes to power while children vanish behind stone walls does not begin his reign on solid ground. Even if he governs firmly afterward, even if he has supporters, even if some accusations against him are exaggerated by enemies, the missing children remain at the foundation. Richard III's reign would stand on that foundation. And because the foundation was cracked, every tremor afterward seemed to confirm that something terrible had been hidden beneath it. Chapter 5. Crowned in Suspicion. A coronation is supposed to turn uncertainty into order. That is the old purpose of it. The ceremony gathers the kingdom's anxieties and dresses them in gold, prayer, music, and ritual. A person enters as a claimant, an heir, a political problem. He leaves as the anointed king. The crown does not erase every doubt, but it tells the realm which doubt must now be treated as treason. Richard's coronation in 1483 carried all of that weight. and more. Because by the time he took the crown, the story had already begun to fracture. Edward V, the boy who had been expected to inherit, was no longer moving toward the throne. His younger brother was no longer a spare heir waiting in the background. Their legitimacy had been challenged. Their public presence had faded. And Richard, once the royal uncle charged with protecting the Yorkist inheritance, now stood at the center of a new argument: that the children of Edward IV had no lawful right to rule. This was the claim that changed everything. The basis was the declaration that Edward IV's children were illegitimate, connected to allegations concerning Edward's marriage. In the political language of the time, legitimacy was not a private family matter. It was the hinge on which the whole kingdom could turn. If Edward's children were legitimate, Richard's rise looked like usurpation. If they were not, Richard could present himself as the lawful adult heir of the House of York, the man rescuing the realm from a compromised succession. That is what makes 1483 so difficult to read cleanly. The legal argument mattered. Medieval kingship depended on lineage, marriage, inheritance, and public recognition. But the timing also mattered. The claim emerged at precisely the moment when Richard needed a path to the throne. A fact can be true and still politically convenient. A legal case can be sincere and still serve ambition. In Richard's case, we are left staring at a decision that may have seemed, to his supporters, like necessary correction, and to his enemies, like a crown being taken by paperwork before it was taken by ceremony. The atmosphere must have been brittle, not because everyone understood the full truth. They did not. We do not. But because too many things were happening too quickly. A child king was displaced. Powerful relatives were neutralized. The royal succession was reinterpreted. The language of protection gave way to the language of illegitimacy. Men who had expected one future were suddenly asked to swear themselves into another. Politics can survive cruelty more easily than confusion. Richard's challenge was not simply to become king. It was to make his kingship feel inevitable after it had first appeared unlikely. That is a much harder task. A ruler who inherits smoothly can borrow the strength of habit. A ruler who interrupts the expected succession must explain the interruption so convincingly that people stop calling it an interruption. The coronation was part of that explanation. It wrapped the claim in sacred form. Bells, robes, oaths, procession, the solemn architecture of monarchy. All of it announced that Richard was not merely a powerful man with soldiers and lawyers. He was king. The public act mattered because legitimacy in this world was not created by documents alone. It had to be seen. It had to be performed before nobles, clergy, and city. It had to enter the eyes before it could settle in the mind. But ceremony has limits. A crown can sit firmly on a head while the room remains unsure. Richard's supporters may have seen him as the only adult Yorkist capable of holding the country together. That interpretation should not be dismissed too quickly. A boy king surrounded by factional rivalry could seem dangerous, not because of the child himself, but because of the adults who would govern through him. Richard had military experience, regional authority, and royal blood. To men fearful of Woodville influence or renewed instability, he may have appeared as the safer choice. Yet the safer choice is not always the rightful one. And even when a political class convinces itself that a hard decision is necessary, the moral cost does not simply disappear. That cost gathered around the princes. Their absence made Richard's coronation feel different from a normal transfer of power. It was not enough for him to be crowned. The realm also had to accept that the boys had somehow ceased to matter. That required more than law. It required a change in emotional reality. People had to stop imagining Edward V as the young king who should have been, and start imagining Richard as the king who must be. Some could do that. Others could not. This is where Richard's reputation began to harden while he was still alive. Not in the polished shape Shakespeare would later give it, but in the anxious talk of a kingdom trying to understand what had happened. Was he the protector of Yorkist stability, stepping in to prevent government by a faction? Or was he the uncle who had used guardianship as a doorway to usurpation? The same sequence of events could be arranged into either story, depending on where one placed trust. And trust was running thin. A fragile legitimacy is a dangerous thing because it forces every ordinary action to carry extra meaning. A royal order becomes a test. A noble hesitation becomes a warning. A rumor becomes evidence. A silence becomes policy. Richard may have worn the crown, but his rule began under conditions in which loyalty had to be watched, measured, and repeatedly secured. He also had to govern as more than a temporary victor. That is easy to forget. The drama of his accession can overwhelm the fact that Richard did attempt to rule. He had laws to uphold, offices to fill, territories to manage, alliances to maintain. A king cannot live forever in the hour of his coronation. Government continues. Petitions arrive. Disputes need judgment. Revenue must be collected. The machinery of rule does not pause simply because the origin of the reign is contested, but for Richard, the beginning never quite released him. The question of how he had become king remained attached to what he did as king. His authority was legal enough to function, ceremonial enough to be recognized, forceful enough to command obedience, but not secure enough to prevent men from imagining alternatives. That is the dangerous middle ground. Not collapse, not confidence. A reign that works, but does not settle. And beyond England, in exile and waiting, there were men who understood exactly what that meant. A disputed king creates space. Into that space can move a rival claimant, a marriage promise, an old grudge, a noble family calculating its future. Richard's coronation was meant to close the crisis of 1483. Instead, it gave his enemies a story they could use. They did not need to prove every accusation beyond doubt. They needed only to present Richard's crown as stained, unstable, and reversible. Once a throne looks reversible, men begin to ask what they might gain by reversing it. Richard had become king. But becoming king was not the same as being safe. His crown had been placed upon his head in public, with all the solemn force the realm could offer. Yet beneath the ritual lay a question no procession could silence: whether England had witnessed the correction of a broken succession, or the most carefully dressed seizure of power in living memory. Chapter 6. The Enemies Gathering in the Shadows. A crown does not only create a king, it creates a target. Once Richard III had taken the throne, the question was no longer simply whether he had a right to rule. The question became whether enough powerful people were willing to live in the world his kingship created. That distinction matters. In politics, belief and convenience often wear the same clothes. A noble might object to Richard from principle, from fear, from loyalty to Edward IV's children, from hatred of a rival faction, or because the new arrangement left him with less than he expected. The result could look the same. Resistance. Richard's reign began with the outward shape of authority. He had been crowned. He had supporters. He controlled the machinery of royal government. But beneath that surface, old loyalties were shifting. Some men who had accepted his rule did so with folded arms rather than open hearts. Others waited to see whether his position would strengthen or crack. A few began looking beyond him, toward a claimant who seemed, at first glance, almost improbably distant from the throne, Henry Tudor. For much of his life, Henry had been less a national figure than a political possibility kept alive by circumstance. He was connected to the Lancastrian side of the old dynastic struggle, though his claim to the crown was not straightforward. In a peaceful kingdom, it might have seemed too thin to carry a serious challenge. But England in 1483 was not peaceful in the deeper sense. It had a crowned king, yes. It had not found rest. Henry's strength lay partly in the fact that he was not Richard. That sounds like a small thing, but in a moment of disputed legitimacy, it could become enormous. A rival claimant does not always need to be loved at first. He needs to be usable. He needs to gather the disappointed, the frightened, the excluded, and the ambitious into one moving shape. Henry Tudor became a place where different forms of opposition could meet without agreeing on everything. Some may have seen him as a Lancastrian restoration, others as a tool to remove Richard, others as a gamble worth making if the rewards were high enough. And some, especially after the disappearance of the princes, may have been drawn toward him because Richard's rule felt morally contaminated. The same banner can mean different things to different hands holding it. This is how threats grow in a kingdom like Richard's. Not all at once, and not always in the open. They grow through letters, promises, marriages discussed before they exist, whispers carried across water, servants listening too carefully, noble households receiving messages with no seal that anyone wishes to acknowledge. They grow in exile, where memory becomes sharper because it has little else to do. They grow among men who have lost office, lands, influence, or confidence. They grow because a king's enemies do not need perfect unity at the beginning. They only need a shared direction. Henry Tudor's great future advantage was the promise of union. A proposed marriage to Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, offered something more powerful than Henry's bloodline alone. It offered a way to bind the wounded houses together, or at least to make that binding appear possible. The symbolism was elegant in the way political symbolism often is. After years of York and Lancaster tearing at the crown, a Tudor marriage to a Yorkist princess could be presented as healing. Of course, healing can also be conquest with better manners. But the idea had force. It allowed Henry's cause to reach people who might never have rallied to a purely Lancastrian claimant. It suggested that removing Richard would not simply reopen the civil wars, but close them. Whether that promise could truly be kept was another matter. At this stage, what mattered was that it could be imagined. Richard understood danger well enough. He had lived too long inside dynastic conflict to mistake a quiet enemy for a harmless one. He knew that loyalty among nobles could be conditional, and that men often discovered their consciences at exactly the moment their interests changed. He moved to secure his position, to reward those who stood by him, and to watch those whose allegiance seemed uncertain. Yet surveillance and punishment have a cost. A king who must keep proving he is secure may begin to look insecure. A ruler who governs through suspicion can make suspicion contagious. Every act of enforcement may be necessary. Every act may also remind observers that the throne is not resting easily. Richard faced the old problem of contested monarchs. To be too gentle could invite rebellion, but to be too severe could justify it in the minds of those already wavering. The failed rising associated with the Duke of Buckingham revealed the fragility of the moment. Buckingham, who had been close to Richard's rise, and his later rebellion showed how quickly proximity could turn into opposition. The motives remain debated, and perhaps no single motive explains everything. Ambition, grievance, fear, calculation, revulsion at the fate of the princes. Each has been suggested, and the evidence does not allow perfect certainty. But politically, the lesson was plain. Richard could lose men who had helped make him king. That is a devastating kind of warning. Enemies from the old Lancastrian world were one thing. Betrayal from within the structure of his own regime was another. It suggested that Richard's authority had not fully settled, even among those who had profited from it. Once such a crack appears, other men begin looking at it. Some look in alarm. Some look with tools. Henry Tudor's circle watched. Exile has often been romanticized, but politically it can be miserable, patient work. A claimant abroad must remain visible enough to matter, but not so exposed that he can be eliminated. He must promise enough to attract support, but not so much that his future rule is already mortgaged before it begins. He must wait for the reigning king to make mistakes, suffer losses, or become vulnerable through events no one can fully control. Richard gave him material. The prince's disappearance remained a wound. The manner of Richard's accession remained disputed. Noble unease had not vanished. And perhaps most importantly, the story of Richard as an unlawful king was portable. It could travel across borders. It could be repeated in courts, in letters, among exiles, among those who needed moral language to cover dangerous choices. Propaganda did not have to invent every fear. It only had to arrange existing fears into a usable shape. This is an important point, because Richard's downfall was not caused by one rumor, one villainous portrait, or one clean moral judgment. It came from accumulation, a questionable succession, missing princes, noble resentment, dynastic alternatives, foreign shelter, the promise of marriage, the memory of civil war. The simple fact that many people could imagine England without Richard, and some were willing to act on that imagination. A secure king makes rebellion seem reckless. A vulnerable king makes rebellion seem like timing. By 1485, Henry Tudor was no longer merely a distant exile with a fragile claim. He was becoming the center of a coalition held together by hope, ambition, and Richard's unhealed legitimacy crisis. Such coalitions can be unstable, but they do not need to last forever. Sometimes they need only survive long enough to reach a battlefield. Richard's enemies were not all standing in the same room, speaking in one voice. They were scattered, cautious, and often self-interested, but they were beginning to move according to the same logic. The crown could be taken, and once that idea enters the bloodstream of a kingdom, even a crowned king must begin listening for footsteps beyond the door. Chapter 7. The Road to Bosworth. By the summer of 1485, Richard III had reached the point every contested ruler fears. The argument over his crown was no longer confined to rumor, law, or memory. It was becoming physical. Men were being called, Ships were being prepared. Roads that had carried merchants, messengers, and ordinary travelers would soon carry armed retainers toward a decision that no document could soften. Henry Tudor was coming. For Richard, the threat was not impressive in the way a great foreign invasion might be impressive. Henry did not arrive as the obvious master of overwhelming force. His claim was fragile, his support mixed, his future dependent on men whose loyalty could not be tested until the moment it mattered. But that was exactly what made the danger so difficult. Henry did not need to be stronger than Richard everywhere. He needed to be strong enough in the right place, at the right hour, while Richard's own support proved less solid than it looked. A medieval king could count troops more easily than he could count trust. Richard gathered his forces as a reigning monarch should. He had the advantage of position, title, and government. He could summon men in the name of royal authority. He could present Henry as an invader, an exile returning with dangerous promises and uncertain backing. On paper, Richard's cause had the cleaner shape, the crowned king defending England against a challenger. But paper does not bleed. The deeper contest was over confidence. Would the nobles who owed Richard service actually fight for him with full commitment? Would those who had accepted his rule risk their futures for it? Would the Stanley family, powerful and carefully positioned, stand firm, hesitate, or choose the side most likely to survive the day? These questions mattered as much as numbers, perhaps more. The road to Bosworth was therefore not only a military march, it was an examination of Richard's reign. Everything unresolved since 1483 traveled with him. The missing princes, the disputed accession, the uneasy nobility, the supporters who had benefited from his rule but might still wonder whether Henry could offer safer terms. Richard was not merely riding to meet an enemy. He was riding into the accumulated consequences of a crown that had never fully escaped suspicion. That does not mean he expected to lose. Richard was an experienced commander, not a doomed figure sleepwalking toward legend. He had seen war before. He understood the value of speed, decision, and royal presence. There is a danger in telling this story backward from the parking lot, as if every step had always been leading to the skeleton beneath the asphalt. History does not feel inevitable to the people inside it. On the morning before Bosworth, Richard was not yet the last Plantagenet. He was the King of England, preparing to defeat a rebel. And he had reason to believe he could. Henry's position was uncertain. His army depended on careful coordination and on support that might dissolve under pressure. A failed invasion would not merely end his claim, it might end him. Richard, meanwhile, could use the language of lawful kingship, national defense, and punishment for treason. If loyalty held, Henry's gamble could collapse quickly. But loyalty was the word that haunted the field before the battle even began. The Stanley brothers, Thomas and William, occupied a dangerous middle space. Their power made them too important to ignore, and their caution made them difficult to read. They had connections to Henry through marriage, but they also operated within Richard's kingdom and under Richard's gaze. In a more settled reign, hesitation from great nobles might be irritating. In Richard's situation, it was potentially fatal. Bosworth would become famous not only for what men did, but for when they chose to do it. Timing is often the hidden weapon in civil war. A noble does not need to declare against a king from the beginning. He can wait. He can watch. He can preserve his strength while others commit. Then, when the shape of the battle begins to reveal itself, he can turn uncertainty into advantage. To the loyalist, this is treachery. To the survivor, it is judgment. Richard's problem was that his kingship left room for judgment. If every major lord had regarded him as untouchably legitimate, delay would have been harder to imagine. But Richard was a king men could calculate against. That is a subtle but devastating condition. It means allegiance becomes less like faith and more like a wager. Still, we should be careful not to flatten the men around him into cowards and opportunists. Some may have feared Richard, some may have disliked him. Some may have doubted Henry, but doubted Richard more. Some may have believed they were protecting their own houses in a world where a wrong choice could destroy generations of work. Noble politics was rarely pure. It was also rarely simple. For ordinary soldiers, the matter may have looked different. They followed lords, banners, obligations, wages, local ties. The grand question of legitimacy reached them through commands and symbols. They would have seen standards moving, armor catching light, messengers riding hard, the nervous organization before battle. Most would not be deciding the future of monarchy in abstract terms. They would be watching the men in front of them and hoping to survive the next hour. That contrast is part of what makes Bosworth so stark. At the top, dynastic history. On the ground, mud, fear, metal, shouted orders, and the blunt fact that political theory eventually asks bodies to pay for it. Richard carried more than strategy into that field. He carried the need to prove that his reign was not a temporary disturbance. Victory would have rewritten the meaning of the previous 2 years. If Henry died or fled, Richard could present the rebellion as one more failed conspiracy against lawful rule. Time might have helped him. Children might have secured succession. Chroniclers might have written differently under a longer reign. A battlefield can decide not only who rules, but which version of events gets the chance to mature. Henry carried a different possibility. If he won, Richard's reign could be compressed into a warning. The usurper punished, the tyrant removed, the realm delivered into a new settlement. Victory would make Henry's claim look stronger after the fact. That is one of history's colder tricks. Success often reaches backward and tidies the path that led to it. So both men approached Bosworth fighting over more than a crown. They were fighting over interpretation. Richard needed the battle to confirm him as king. Henry needed it to reveal Richard as removable. The nobles around them needed to decide which future they preferred, or which future they feared least. And somewhere in that tense space between conviction and calculation, the fate of the Plantagenet line was narrowing. It is tempting to imagine the night before Bosworth as thick with omens. Later stories have loved that kind of atmosphere. Dreams, warnings, strange signs. These gather naturally around the deaths of kings, but even without them, the reality is unsettling enough. Richard had reached the edge of the question that had followed him since the princes disappeared and the crown came to him through controversy. Would men die for his version of England? The answer could not be argued into existence. It could not be proclaimed from a throne, or sealed in a statute, or staged in a coronation procession. It had to be revealed in motion, under pressure, when fear made every loyalty honest. Morning would bring the test, and on the field near Bosworth, Richard III would discover that a crown can command many things, but not always the final courage of those who stand just far enough away to choose. Chapter 8. The Last Charge of the Last Plantagenet. Battles are often remembered as if they were clean moments. One side advances, the other breaks. A king falls. A dynasty ends. Later, the whole day can be reduced to a sentence, polished until it feels inevitable. Bosworth was not clean. It was a moving, uncertain field of hesitation, opportunity, fear, and sudden decision. Men who had sworn loyalty had to decide what loyalty was worth when the future was no longer obvious. Henry Tudor had to survive long enough for his gamble to become a reign. Richard III had to do something harder than win a battle. He had to force certainty onto a kingdom that had spent 2 years doubting him. At some point in the fighting, Richard saw the chance. Henry was within reach, not symbolically within reach, not merely politically vulnerable. Physically close enough that a hard strike might end the invasion at its living center. Medieval battles could be decided not only by formations and numbers, but by the death or capture of a leader. If Henry Tudor fell, the coalition around him might unravel with remarkable speed. Men who had arrived cautiously would suddenly rediscover their caution. Promises made in exile would become dangerous memories. Richard's enemies would have to explain why they had backed a dead claimant. So Richard charged. It is one of the few parts of his final day that has survived with a kind of grim clarity. The king did not simply wait to be swallowed by events. He acted. He led a direct attack toward Henry, a violent attempt to cut through the uncertainty by killing the man around whom it had gathered. There is a revealing contradiction here. The Richard of legend is often imagined as twisted, secretive, almost spider-like, working through plots and darkness. But the Richard at Bosworth was not hiding behind a curtain. He was in the open field, taking the most dangerous route available. Whatever else he was, cowardice is difficult to fit into that final image. That does not make him noble in every sense. Courage is not innocence. A ruthless man can be brave. A compromised king can die with extraordinary physical resolve. History is full of people whose virtues and crimes refuse to cancel each other neatly. Richard's last charge matters because it does not rescue him from suspicion. It complicates him. It gives the villain a soldier's ending. The fighting around the charge was brutal, close, and brief in the way decisive violence often is. Richard's men pushed toward Henry's position. Accounts suggest that he came dangerously near his rival. The king's attack was not a ceremonial gesture. It was a real attempt to end the battle with his own body as the spear point. And then the field turned against him. The exact sequence of every movement remains debated, as battlefield details from the 15th century often do. But the larger outcome is clear. The support Richard needed did not hold in the way he needed it to hold. The Stanleys, whose hesitation had haunted the approach to Bosworth, intervened against him. Whether one calls it betrayal, calculation, delayed commitment, or survival depends partly on where one stands in the story. From Richard's position, the distinction would have been meaningless. A king in the middle of battle does not have the luxury of footnotes. He would have seen the practical truth. Men he needed were not saving him. Men aligned with his enemy were closing in. The gamble of the charge had failed to reach Henry in time. The crown, which had required so much argument, ceremony, and suspicion to hold, had now come down to a shrinking space of ground. Richard fought on. That detail has endured for a reason. It gives the end a hard, almost spare dignity, even for those who believe the worst of him. He was not captured in a quiet retreat. He did not slip away and try to bargain from a safer distance. He died in the fighting, surrounded by enemies, the last English monarch to be killed in battle. That fact has an almost unnatural weight. England had known kings deposed, imprisoned, murdered, executed, exiled. But Richard's death at Bosworth closed something older. He was the last Plantagenet king, the last ruler from a line that had shaped English monarchy for centuries. His death was not only the death of a man whose reign had lasted a little more than 2 years, it was the violent full stop at the end of a dynastic sentence that had begun long before anyone on that field was born. Later generations would attach meaning to that full stop. The Tudors would turn it into Providence. Shakespeare would turn it into theater. Modern historians would turn it back over, looking for the man beneath the layers. But on the field itself, meaning would have arrived in fragments. A fallen standard, a riderless horse, men shouting that the king was dead, soldiers recalculating their loyalties in the space between one breath and the next. The death of a king changes sound. Orders lose authority. Courage drains from some men and rises strangely in others. A battle that had been uncertain begins to become a pursuit, a collapse, a settlement. Those who fought for Richard now had to survive the victory of someone they had opposed. Those who waited too long had to explain why their waiting had been wisdom. Those who chose Henry could begin arranging themselves around a new son. Richard, meanwhile, had become something politically useful in death. A dead king cannot correct the story. He cannot reward loyalty or punish betrayal. He cannot defend the legal argument that brought him to the throne. He cannot produce the princes, answer the rumors, or soften the memory of his accession. He becomes available. His body belongs to the victors. His reputation, soon enough, will follow. This is where Bosworth becomes more than a battle. It becomes the point where physical defeat turns into narrative defeat. Richard's enemies did not merely remove him. They inherited the power to explain him. And because his reign already carried suspicion, explanation was easy to sharpen. The battle could be presented not as a risky invasion that succeeded through timing and noble calculation, but as the rightful fall of a tyrant. Victory simplifies. That is one of its great privileges. Henry Tudor's survival on the field allowed him to become Henry VII. Once crowned, he could look back on Bosworth as the beginning of order rather than the outcome of a dangerous gamble. Richard's charge, from the Tudor perspective, could be treated as the last violence of a desperate man. From another angle, it was the final act of a king trying to settle history by force of arms. Both views contain something true. Neither is complete. What remains striking is the intensity of Richard's final decision. He did not choose caution. He did not choose distance. He chose to ride straight at the fragile center of his enemy's claim. In that moment, the entire conflict narrowed almost brutally. 2 claimants, 1 field, and the possibility that the future of England might be decided by whether a king's charge could reach one man before the rest of the battle reached him. It could not. Richard III died with the crown's argument still unresolved. His body fell, but the questions around him did not. They would travel with his corpse from the battlefield into public display, into burial, into rumor, into Tudor history, into Shakespeare's language, and eventually beneath a modern parking lot where no royal monument marked the place. At Bosworth, the last Plantagenet king lost more than his life. He lost control of his ending. Chapter 9. A body displayed, a dynasty erased. After Bosworth, Richard III was no longer a king in command of men. He was a body. That change is easy to say and difficult to absorb. Only hours earlier, His presence on the field had carried legal authority, dynastic memory, fear, loyalty, and command. Men moved because he ordered them. Men hesitated because opposing him was dangerous. His name could summon armies. His seal could transform decisions into law. Then the battle ended, and all that authority left him with shocking speed. The dead body of a defeated king is a political object. It must be handled carefully, not because it is honored, but because it is useful. If hidden, it may become a rumor. If treated too gently, it may invite sympathy. If displayed, it can announce the new reality in a language no proclamation can match. The old king is not absent. He is defeated. Look. See for yourself. Richard's corpse was stripped and taken from the battlefield to Leicester. Accounts of the treatment vary in detail, and later retellings have not always resisted the temptation to make the humiliation darker. But the broad meaning is clear enough. His body was exposed to public view. The display was not a private cruelty with no political purpose. It was a message. The reign was over. In a world where false reports could travel quickly and claimants could reappear with inconvenient timing, seeing mattered. A dead king needed witnesses. Henry Tudor's victory had to become more than news from a battlefield. It had to become a fact the country could accept, fear, repeat, and build upon. Richard's displayed body helped make that possible. There is a harsh practicality to it. Modern viewers may instinctively look for dignity around the dead, especially around a king. But medieval politics was often unsentimental about bodies. A corpse could prove justice, warn enemies, settle doubts, or demonstrate possession. Richard had died violently trying to defend a throne. In defeat, his body became evidence that the throne was available to someone else, that someone was Henry Tudor. Henry's position after Bosworth was both triumphant and precarious. Victory had given him the crown, but victory alone did not make every question disappear. His blood claim was not the strongest in a simple hereditary sense. His success depended on coalition, timing, and the collapse of Richard's support. He needed to turn a battlefield outcome into a dynasty, so he did what successful founders must do. He shaped the meaning of the past. Henry VII's reign would present Bosworth as the beginning of restoration, not merely the success of an invasion. Richard's rule could be made to look like an interruption, a corruption, a sickness in the body of the realm. Henry's victory could then appear not as opportunism, but as cure. This was narrative work as much as political work, and it began almost immediately. The defeated king's memory had to be managed. Richard could not be allowed to remain simply brave, lawful to his supporters, and unlucky. He had to become the kind of man whose fall seemed deserved. The unresolved fate of the princes helped enormously. The disputed path to his coronation helped. The old unease around his reign provided rich material. Henry did not need to invent a reputation from blank parchment. He inherited suspicion and gave it royal permission to harden. This is one of the quiet cruelties of losing power. Your enemies do not need to lie about everything. They only need to choose what will be remembered first. For Richard, the first remembered things became the darkest ones: the tower, the nephews, the sudden crown, the twisted body of legend, the battlefield death. Other parts of his life, his loyalty to Edward IV, his northern governance, his military experience, his actual physical condition, as opposed to theatrical deformity, did not disappear completely. But they were pushed to the margins. They were less useful to the new order. A dynasty does not only govern the future, it edits the past. The Tudor dynasty, founded by Henry VII, would become one of the most famous in English history. Its later monarchs would dominate the national imagination so completely that the fragile beginning at Bosworth can almost vanish behind the grandeur that followed. Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, the Reformation, the Armada, the great dramas of Tudor rule. These cast long backward shadows, making Henry VII's victory seem more inevitable than it was. But in 1485, nothing was inevitable yet. Henry had to secure allegiance, neutralize threats, marry strategically, and create a sense that the civil wars could end through him. His promised marriage to Elizabeth of York would become central to that image. By joining his Lancastrian associated claim to a Yorkist princess, he could present the new dynasty as a reconciliation of broken houses. The symbolism was powerful enough to survive, even if the politics beneath it were more complicated. Richard's death made that symbolism possible. As long as Richard lived, he was not merely a rival king. He was a living objection. His survival would have given Yorkist resistance a center. His death removed that center, but it also created a different problem: how to prevent him from becoming a martyr. Public humiliation helped with that. So did burial without the grandeur expected for an anointed king. So did the slow work of hostile memory. Richard's body was taken to Leicester and buried at the Greyfriars Friary. There was no ancient royal tomb prepared through generations of planning. No dynasty gathered around his grave to guard his reputation. He entered the earth in the city, where his corpse had been displayed, under the care of friars whose house would itself later disappear. That detail feels almost too precise. A king whose story would be buried under hostile legend was placed in a grave that would eventually be buried under the changing city. The physical and the narrative fates began to echo each other. First, the body lost its royal protection. Then the grave lost its visible place. Then the friary vanished. Then the map of memory became uncertain. But before the asphalt, before the parking lot, before the archaeologists and the cameras, there was this first act of disappearance. The defeated king reduced to a corpse, displayed to end doubt, buried without enduring monument, and surrendered to a future in which his enemies would speak more loudly than his bones. It is tempting to imagine that history remembers kings automatically. It does not. History remembers what institutions preserve, what victors repeat, what writers dramatize, what later generations find useful. Richard had worn a crown, but the crown did not protect his memory after death. Henry VII gained the throne, and with it came the greater prize: the authority to explain why Richard had never deserved to keep it. That explanation would become easier with every passing decade. The man was dead. The dynasty was erased. The story was available. And in the space left behind, the Tudors began to build not only a government, but a version of the past in which Richard III could serve as the necessary darkness before their dawn. Chapter 10. The Greyfriars Grave. Richard III was buried in a place that was never meant to become a mystery. Greyfriars was not a lost kingdom, not a hidden chamber, not a secret tomb prepared by conspirators. It was a friary in Leicester, part of the religious landscape of medieval England. The friars who lived there belonged to a world in which prayer, burial, charity, and urban life overlapped. Their buildings stood within the town, woven into streets and property lines, close to the movement of ordinary people. That is where the defeated king was placed. The accounts that locate Richard's burial at Greyfriars gave later searchers something precious. Not certainty in the modern archaeological sense, but a direction. A body taken to Leicester. A burial among the Franciscan friars. A grave somewhere within a religious house that once had walls, a church, a choir, and a place in the city's memory. For a time, that may have been enough. The people of late 15th century Leicester did not need a modern plaque to know where Greyfriars stood. The friary was part of the visible town. Its buildings could be entered, passed, described. Its community had a presence. If someone spoke of the king buried there, the phrase pointed to a real place, not to an abstraction. But places can die in stages. First, the person is buried. Then the witnesses age. Then the generation that heard the story from witnesses becomes old. Then the buildings change hands, or decay, or are repurposed. Then records are copied, lost, misread, or ignored. The ground remains where it always was, but the human map above it begins to slip. In Richard's case, that slipping became dramatic after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. Religious houses across England were closed, their lands seized or redistributed, their buildings stripped, sold, adapted, or destroyed. Greyfriars was one small part of that vast transformation. To Henry VIII's government, such houses were wealth, policy, and religious controversy. To later historians searching for Richard, the dissolution was something else. The moment the visible container of his grave began to disappear, the friary did not vanish like smoke in a single afternoon. Stone, land, and memory usually have more stubborn lives than that. But its religious purpose ended. Its structures were broken up or folded into later development. Over time, Leicester continued being Leicester. Streets were adjusted. Property boundaries shifted. New buildings rose where older walls had stood. People bought, sold, paved, built, demolished, and rebuilt. The living city did what living cities do. It made use of space. This is where Richard's story becomes strangely modern. We often imagine lost graves as lying in wild places, under forests, in ruined castles, or on remote hillsides where the wind has had centuries to practice sounding meaningful. Richard was lost in a city. He was not hidden from humanity by distance. He was hidden by proximity. Too many lives passed over him. Too many practical needs occupied the ground. The past was not far away. It was simply underfoot. A rumor later circulated that Richard's remains had been dug up and thrown into the River Soar. Stories like this tend to flourish when a grave is known to be lost, but not known to be empty. They offer a satisfying cruelty, a final insult after humiliation. They also tidy the uncertainty. If the body was thrown into the river, then the search is over before it begins. There is no grave to find, only a legend to repeat. But legends are not the same as evidence. The river story mattered because it showed how easily absence can become invention. When the exact site of a burial disappears, imagination rushes into the gap. Some people assume destruction. Others assume concealment. Others assume the grave must have been moved, desecrated, or deliberately erased. Sometimes they are right. Often they are filling silence with a story that feels appropriate. Richard's case invited exactly that kind of storytelling. He had been controversial in life, humiliated after death, and darkened by Tudor memory. It seemed almost fitting that his body would suffer one more indignity. The legend matched the mood. That may be why it persisted. Yet the older claim remained. Greyfriars. And for anyone willing to take the claim seriously, the real problem was not whether the medieval source named a place. The problem was whether that place could still be located beneath the modern city with enough precision to make excavation meaningful. A lost friary is not a single dot. It is a complex of buildings. A church has a nave, choir, aisles, walls, floors, graves, and phases of construction. Even if one finds the friary, one must still find the right part of it. A king's grave can be lost within a lost church inside a changed town. That is a difficult kind of disappearance. Maps helped, but maps are not magic. Old property boundaries can preserve echoes of vanished buildings, yet they do not always speak plainly. Antiquarian notes can guide, but they may be incomplete or mistaken. Later development can disturb or destroy archaeology, but sometimes it protects it by sealing older layers beneath foundations and surfaces. The modern city becomes both enemy and guardian. It covers the past, but it may also keep pieces of it in place. This is the paradox that made the search possible. If Greyfriars had been completely obliterated by deep basements, heavy foundations, and careless destruction, Richard's grave might have been gone. If the site had remained open and marked, there would have been no mystery. Instead, parts of the friary's footprint passed into ordinary urban use. Eventually, one piece of that lost sacred landscape became a parking lot. A very unromantic survival. And yet, perhaps that is exactly why the story grips us. The contrast is almost too perfect. A medieval king beneath painted parking bays. But the deeper lesson is less amusing and more unsettling. Modern surfaces do not erase history simply because they look clean. Asphalt is not an ending. It is a lid. For centuries, people argued over Richard's character with far more confidence than they could point to his grave. They knew the villain, or thought they did. They knew the legend. They knew the play. But the physical man had slipped away into a city that had no reason to arrange itself around his memory. Greyfriars became a name without a building, then a location without certainty, then a historical problem, and finally, to a small group of determined searchers, a challenge. The question was no longer only where Richard had been buried. It was whether the layers of Leicester still remembered what the written record had nearly lost. Somewhere beneath property lines, tarmac, pipes, bricks, and centuries of ordinary use, the friary might still have left a trace. Somewhere within that trace, the church might still be readable. Somewhere within the church, the choir might still be found. And somewhere in the choir, if the old accounts were right and the later rumors were wrong, the last Plantagenet king might still be waiting exactly where he had been placed. Chapter 11. The Making of a Monster. Long after Richard III was dead, he became more useful than he had ever been alive. Not as a ruler, not as a military commander, not even as the defeated king at Bosworth. He became useful as a warning, a shape into which writers could pour ambition, deformity, murder, divine punishment, and the convenient lesson that the Tudors had rescued England from something unnatural. This was not done by one hand in one moment. Reputations are built like old walls. One layer is added, then another, until later visitors mistake the whole structure for something that has always been there. Richard's darker image developed through chronicles, political memory, Tudor interests, moral interpretation, and, eventually, theater. Shakespeare did not invent every accusation against Richard. That would be too simple. But Shakespeare gave the accusations a body, a voice, and a rhythm that refused to die. Before Shakespeare, there were already reasons for Richard to be remembered harshly. His path to the throne had been controversial. His nephews had disappeared. He had died fighting the man who founded the next dynasty. Those facts, or suspected facts, created fertile ground. Tudor writers did not need to begin with innocence and manufacture guilt from nothing. They began with a damaged reputation and cultivated it carefully. The most powerful propaganda rarely feels like pure invention. It feels like interpretation. A writer chooses where to begin. He chooses which motives to emphasize. He chooses which silences to treat as confession. He chooses whether a physical condition is described clinically, sympathetically, mockingly, or symbolically. Over time, those choices create a person who may resemble the original only in outline. Richard's body became one of the central battlegrounds. Later descriptions exaggerated him into a figure whose appearance seemed to prove his moral nature. This was not unusual for the period. People often read the body as a sign of the soul, and political enemies could use physical difference as moral evidence. A curved spine could become a crooked spirit. Uneven shoulders could become visible corruption. Disability, in this kind of storytelling, was not treated as ordinary human variation. It was turned into accusation. That is one of the ugliest parts of Richard's afterlife. The later monster was not built only out of alleged crimes. He was built out of the idea that the body itself could testify against the man. The more deformed Richard became in the telling, the easier it was to imagine that nature had marked him for villainy before history had even tested him. This gave the legend a kind of cruel efficiency. Viewers did not have to weigh evidence. They could look at the character and feel that guilt had already been drawn into his bones. Shakespeare understood the dramatic power of that. His Richard is not merely accused by others. He invites the audience into his own performance of villainy. He is witty, bitter, seductive, and alarming. He makes evil theatrical. He turns conspiracy into conversation. The audience becomes almost complicit, listening to him explain what he intends to do before the other characters understand the danger they are in. That intimacy is brilliant drama. It is also dangerous history, because once a character becomes vivid enough, he can overtake the archive. Many people who know almost nothing about 15th century government still know the feeling of Shakespeare's Richard, the smiling plotter, the twisted body, the crown reached through blood. The play made Richard memorable in a way that careful qualification rarely can. Evidence speaks in measured sentences. Theater speaks in thunder and timing, and audiences remember thunder. Yet we should not imagine Tudor propaganda as a crude machine forcing everyone to believe the same lie. The process was more subtle, and perhaps more durable because of that. Richard's image served several needs at once. It justified Henry VII's seizure of the throne. It gave moral order to the chaos of civil war. It offered a satisfying explanation for the disappearance of the princes. It transformed dynastic violence into a story with a villain at the center. People like stories with centers. The Wars of the Roses were messy. Rival claims, shifting alliances, noble betrayals, battles, reversals, marriages, exiles, and legal arguments difficult to compress into a clean moral tale. Richard solved that problem for later storytellers. Put him in the middle, make him monstrous enough, and the confusion begins to organize itself around him. He becomes the reason the old world had to end. But that organization comes at a cost. It narrows history. It asks one man to carry more meaning than one man can honestly bear. Richard may have committed terrible acts. He may have authorized the removal or death of the princes. He may have believed his seizure of power was necessary, lawful, or both. He may have been more ruthless than his defenders liked to admit, and less monstrous than his enemies insisted. The trouble is that the legend discourages that uncomfortable middle ground. A monster does not need context. A man does. This is why Richard's story has produced such intense argument. For some, challenging the Tudor image feels like restoring justice to a slandered king. For others, defending Richard risks minimizing the disappearance of two children and the brutal politics of his rise. Both instincts come from a real place. One resists propaganda. The other resists romantic revision. The better path is harder. It is to hold suspicion and skepticism at the same time. We can recognize that Tudor writers had every reason to darken Richard's name without pretending he was merely a victim of bad publicity. We can admit that Shakespeare's Richard is one of the most powerful villains in English literature without treating him as a witness statement. We can see that the curved spine found centuries later was real, while also seeing how grotesquely that condition had been exaggerated into moral theater. The discovery at Leicester would eventually expose the distance between body and legend in a literal way. The skeleton did show scoliosis. It did not show the monstrous caricature that tradition had loved. The physical truth was both confirming and correcting. Yes, there had been a spinal curvature. No, it did not justify the elaborate mythology of deformity that had gathered around him. That is the strange thing about evidence. It rarely gives us the simple reversal we want. The bones did not say Richard was innocent. They did not say Tudor writers lied about everything. They did not solve the princes in the tower. But they did puncture one of the legend's oldest habits, the belief that a body could be read as a confession. In that sense, the skeleton did not merely identify Richard. It challenged the way Richard had been imagined. The making of a monster is not only an old political story, it is a warning about how memory works. A useful version of a person can outlive the person so completely that later generations must fight to remember there was ever a difference. The villain becomes familiar. The familiar becomes true. The true becomes difficult to question, because questioning it feels almost like defending evil. Richard III's reputation was built in that dangerous space, between evidence and usefulness, between political need and theatrical genius, between the real violence of his world and the later pleasure of making him singularly vile. By the time the modern searchers began looking for his grave, they were not only searching through layers of Leicester's soil. They were searching through layers of interpretation, performance, exaggeration, and inherited certainty. They were looking for a body that had been buried in earth, and for a man who had been buried inside a role. The role had survived magnificently. The man was still missing. Chapter 12. The search begins. The search for Richard III began with an idea that sounded almost unreasonable. A lost medieval king, buried somewhere beneath a modern city, after centuries of religious upheaval, construction, rumor, and neglect. It had the flavor of something that should belong to historical fiction. A monarch beneath a parking lot, waiting while traffic passed overhead. Sensible people could be forgiven for doubting it. But serious searches often begin by refusing one lazy assumption. In this case, the assumption was that Richard was simply gone. Gone into the river, perhaps. Gone beneath development. Gone because the friary had vanished. Gone because 5 centuries had passed, and cities are not kind to fragile traces. Gone because the story had become too legendary to be treated as a practical archaeological problem. Yet, lost is not the same as destroyed. That distinction became the thin opening through which the search could begin. The people who pursued Richard's grave were not chasing a random fantasy. They had a historical location to test. Greyfriars in Leicester. They had old records, maps, scholarly arguments, local memory, and the stubborn fact that the body had never been proven removed. The task was not to wander through Leicester hoping for a miracle. It was to ask whether the old friary could be mapped onto the modern city with enough accuracy to dig. The Richard III Society played an important role in keeping the question alive. To some, a society devoted to reassessing Richard might sound like a gathering of loyal defenders trying to rescue their king from bad press. And yes, there has always been passion in Richard's afterlife. But passion alone does not find a grave. At some point, loyalty has to become research, and research has to accept the risk of being wrong. That risk was real. If excavation found nothing, the idea would look naive. If the friary had been badly damaged, the search might reveal only fragments. If human remains appeared, they might belong to someone else entirely. Medieval churches often held burials. A skeleton under Greyfriars would not automatically be Richard. The searchers had to be open to disappointment, because without that openness, the work would not be investigation. It would be wishful thinking with a trowel. What made the project remarkable was not only the hope behind it, but the method. Old Leicester had to be read through modern Leicester. Streets, property lines, historic descriptions, archaeological probability, all of these had to be compared. The vanished friary was not floating in imagination. It had occupied land. Land leaves clues. Boundaries persist. Odd shapes in urban plans can preserve the memory of older enclosures. Later buildings may erase, but they may also avoid certain foundations or seal older surfaces beneath them. A city is an archive, but it does not arrange its pages for easy reading. The search required a different kind of attention from the one usually given to kings. Royal history often looks upward. Crowns, councils, battles, marriages, portraits. This search looked downward. It treated an unglamorous patch of urban ground as a document. The question was not what Richard had said, or what Shakespeare had made him say, but what Leicester's soil might still contain. That shift is important. For centuries, Richard had existed as argument. Was he a murderer? A reformer? A usurper? A victim of Tudor propaganda? A necessary strongman? A villain inflated by theater? These questions are not meaningless, but they can circle endlessly because they depend on damaged records, partisan accounts, and interpretations shaped by later needs. Archaeology offered another kind of witness. Not a neutral witness exactly. Soil can be disturbed, bones can be ambiguous, context can be misread, but a witness not interested in pleasing either Tudors or Ricardians. The ground has no dynasty. It would be wrong, though, to imagine the search as coldly scientific from the beginning to the end. Human curiosity powered it. So did emotion. Richard's missing body had become a symbol of historical injustice for some, and a symbol of unresolved mystery for others. The idea that he might still be in Leicester not scattered or destroyed, but waiting in the approximate place where records said he had been buried, carried a strange moral pull. There is something deeply human about wanting the dead to be located, even controversial dead, perhaps especially them. A known grave does not settle a life, but it gives the argument a point of contact. It says, whatever we think of him, this person occupied space, suffered injury, died, and was placed here. The abstraction becomes physical again. The search also challenged a modern prejudice, the belief that ordinary places cannot be historically charged. A cathedral looks like history. A battlefield can be made to look like history. A museum announces history before you enter the door. A parking lot does the opposite. It tells you to move along, to pay, to park between the lines. It is useful, flat, forgettable. That forgettability became part of the mystery's power. If Richard could be there, then the past was not confined to places that looked suitably ancient. It could survive beneath the most functional surfaces of daily life. The city had not preserved him by honoring him. It had preserved him by accidentally covering him. In that sense, the search began as an argument against appearances. The site did not look royal. The story did not sound likely. The trail was old. The evidence was incomplete. But each weakness had to be tested rather than merely assumed fatal. That is often where historical discovery begins, not with certainty, but with disciplined doubt. Doubt that asks, what exactly do we know? What do we only repeat? What has been checked? What has merely become comfortable? The old river story, for example, could have ended the search if treated as fact. But when examined as a tradition rather than proof, it lost some of its authority. The disappearance of Greyfriars could have ended the search if lost meant unlocatable. But urban archaeology exists precisely because lost structures sometimes remain legible below modern layers. The passage of time could have ended the search if 5 centuries guaranteed destruction. It does not. So the searchers proceeded, not because success was likely in a romantic sense, but because the case was strong enough to test. That is a quieter and better kind of drama. No prophecy, no secret map with a red mark, no sudden revelation from a hidden manuscript, just the slow assembling of reasons to open the ground. And beneath all of it was a larger question. If Richard's remains were found, what would they actually change? They would not reopen Bosworth. They would not return the princes. They would not make Tudor propaganda vanish. They would not prove Richard saint or monster, but they might restore scale. They might bring the man back into view beneath the role. They might show where the legend had distorted the body, and where the body confirmed something the legend had kept in cruel exaggeration. The search began then, not as an attempt to solve every argument, but as an attempt to recover one stubborn fact. Where was he? For more than 500 years, that question had sat beneath other questions, quieter but more concrete. Before Richard could be reassessed, defended, condemned, or understood, he had to be found. Not as a line in a chronicle, not as a character on stage, not as the darkness before the Tudors, as remains in the earth. The strange thing is that the answer, if it existed at all, was not hidden in a remote ruin. It lay within the ordinary discipline of measuring, comparing, digging, and believing that a city's surface might be less final than it appeared. The search began because a few people were willing to take the old record seriously enough to test it against the ground. And soon, the ground would be opened. Chapter 13. Digging Through the Modern City. The first cut through the asphalt was not glamorous. That is worth remembering. Discoveries like this are often retold as if history rises cleanly from the ground, as if the moment a shovel touches earth, the past knows it is being summoned. Real archaeology is less theatrical. It begins with permissions, trenches, machinery, safety fencing, measurements, and the patient removal of layers that were never designed to be meaningful. The Leicester excavation had to pass through the skin of a modern city before it could reach anything medieval. Asphalt came first, then the compacted materials beneath it. Then the mixed evidence of later centuries. Disturbances, services, foundations, fragments of ordinary urban change. Every city is a stack of decisions. Someone builds a wall, someone removes it, someone lays a pipe, someone levels a yard, someone paves over all of it, because parking has become more urgent than memory. Beneath those decisions, the archaeologists were looking for the footprint of Greyfriars. Not Richard, at least not immediately. That is an important distinction. To find the king, they first had to find the place that had held him. The search was less like opening a treasure chest than reconstructing a vanished building from scars in the ground. A wall line here, a floor surface there, a change in soil, a burial, a fragment that suggests orientation. Slowly, the lost friary had to be persuaded back into shape. The contrast between the work and the legend could hardly have been sharper. Richard III had become one of English history's most recognizable villains. His name carried battle, murder, theater, propaganda, and centuries of argument. Yet the search for him depended on objects and traces that were almost stubbornly plain. Mortar, stone, soil color, the angle of a trench, the depth of a layer. The sort of evidence that does not announce itself, but waits to be read by people trained to notice small differences. That is the discipline hidden beneath the drama. The parking lot itself was not a stage dressed for revelation. It was bounded by modern walls, marked by bays, surrounded by the routine life of Leicester. Cars had stopped there. Workers had crossed it. The surface belonged to schedules, errands, deliveries, and the mild irritation of finding somewhere to park. If there is a lesson in that, it is not merely that history hides. It is that history often survives in places where no one is being asked to feel reverent. Reverence, in fact, might have been a distraction. The archaeologists could not dig as if every bone belonged to Richard, or every wall belonged to the church they hoped to find. They had to let the site resist them. Medieval friaries were complex places. Human remains in such a setting were not unusual. Burials could belong to friars, benefactors, townspeople, or others granted space within the religious precinct. A skeleton alone would not be enough. Context would matter. And context is slow. The excavation began to reveal features consistent with the lost friary. The modern city, for all its alterations, had not completely erased the medieval one. Under the asphalt, Greyfriars was not alive, but it was legible. That word may sound too neat for the mess of mud and trench edges, but it captures the change. A place that had existed mostly in records and debate was becoming physical again. For the searchers, that must have been the first true shift in atmosphere. Before then, Richard was still largely an argument projected onto a site. After the early archaeological findings, the site began answering back. The old claims about Greyfriars were no longer floating above the map. They were touching soil. The vanished friary had left enough of itself behind to make the next question unavoidable. If this was Greyfriars, where was the church? And if the church could be found, where was the choir? Medieval burial location mattered. The accounts suggested Richard had been buried in the Greyfriars church, and the choir area was especially important. But a church is not found all at once. It is inferred from walls, alignments, floor levels, and the relationship of one feature to another. The search had to move from broad probability to specific placement. That narrowing gives the story its tension, not the false tension of a curse or a secret code, but the quieter tension of method approaching consequence. Each trench either strengthened or weakened the case. Each feature adjusted the map. Each discovery made some possibilities more likely, and others less so. Archaeology is powerful partly because it can disappoint. It can say no. It can reveal that a cherished theory has been placed a few meters wrong, or that later construction has destroyed what everyone hoped would survive. Here, the ground did not say no. At least not yet. As the excavation progressed, the ordinary parking lot began to separate into layers of time. The modern surface remained visible above, but beneath it, an older Leicester appeared. Not the whole medieval town, not a romantic reconstruction, but enough to show that the past had not been completely consumed. The friary had been broken, repurposed, covered, and forgotten, but it had not entirely surrendered its shape. There is something almost unsettling in that patience. Human memory had failed. The institution was dissolved. The buildings were gone. The grave became uncertain. The king's reputation wandered through plays, histories, arguments, and classrooms. But the buried structures remained in place, not preserving meaning in any conscious sense, simply existing beneath the practical world until someone asked the right question. The archaeologists worked in that space between accident and intention. They did not create the survival of Greyfriars. They recognized it. They did not invent the possibility that Richard lay there. They tested it, and with every layer removed, the distance between the legendary king and the material site grew smaller. Still, even at this stage, caution mattered. A discovery can become distorted by desire before it is fully understood. Everyone involved knew the story was extraordinary. Everyone also had to remember that extraordinary stories attract premature certainty. A wall was not yet a royal grave. A burial was not yet Richard. A promising location was not proof. The site had to be allowed to become evidence in the proper order. That restraint is part of what gives the eventual discovery its force. Because when the remains appeared, they did not emerge from nowhere. They came from a chain of reasoning. Records pointing to Greyfriars, urban analysis identifying a likely site, trenches revealing the friary, structural evidence suggesting the church, and then a burial found in a place that suddenly made the impossible feel uncomfortably possible. The parking lot had become a threshold. Above it, the modern city continued. People still had jobs, appointments, traffic, lunch breaks. Around the excavation, life did not stop to make room for a lost king. That may be the most honest image of the whole search. Archaeologists kneeling in a trench, while the ordinary world pressed close on every side. Not history in a sealed museum, but history interrupting a weekday. And beneath the asphalt, in the footprint of a vanished church, the investigation was approaching the one thing no legend could supply: a body. Chapter 14. The skeleton in the choir. The discovery did not begin with a crown. It began with bones in the ground. That is a small but important correction to the imagination. No golden object announced Richard III. No inscription rose politely from the soil to settle 5 centuries of argument. What appeared was a human skeleton, damaged by time, held in the earth within the remains of what seemed to be the choir area of the lost Greyfriars Church, a body in the right place. That was the first shock. Not proof, not yet. Archaeology does not work by theatrical recognition, but the location mattered deeply. The search had been built on the idea that Richard had been buried at Greyfriars, within the friary church. To find a grave in that area was already significant. To find one with unusual features was something else entirely. The burial did not look grand. There was no elaborate tomb surviving around it. No sign of the careful magnificence later generations might expect for a king. The grave appeared hurried, constrained, and plain. The body's position was awkward, with little of the formal dignity associated with royal burial that matched, in a chilling way, the story of Richard's death. A defeated monarch, stripped of power, brought to Leicester not as a revered sovereign, but as evidence of another man's victory. Still, a poor burial alone could not identify him. Many people were buried without splendor. Many graves are strange for practical reasons. Soil shifts. Coffins decay. Later disturbances alter what was once orderly. The first rule, in such a moment, is not to let hope run ahead of the evidence. Then came the spine. The skeleton showed a pronounced curvature, consistent with scoliosis. Not the grotesque hunchback of centuries of legend. Not the stage villain's body, made almost symbolic in its deformity, but a real spinal condition visible in the bones. This was the kind of detail that could both confirm and correct tradition at the same time. It was an eerie convergence. For generations, Richard's enemies and later dramatists had made his body part of the case against his soul. They exaggerated, moralized, and turned physical difference into theater. Yet the skeleton suggested there had been a physical basis beneath the distortion. The legend had not invented curvature from nothing, but it had changed its meaning. It had taken a medical reality and weaponized it into character assassination. That is why the spine mattered beyond identification. It reminded everyone that even hostile stories can preserve fragments of truth while also poisoning them. A rumor may carry a real detail across centuries, but by the time it reaches us, the detail may be wrapped in cruelty. The task is to separate the body from the accusation that was built around it. The skeleton also bore signs of violence. There were injuries consistent with battle trauma, including wounds to the skull. Again, caution was necessary. Bones record injury, but they do not narrate every motion that caused it. They do not name the weapon with courtroom certainty or tell us the exact last seconds of a life. But taken together, the wounds suggested a violent death, fitting a man killed in combat and treated harshly afterward. Here, the distance between story and evidence narrowed further. A male skeleton, in the choir area of Greyfriars, with scoliosis, with battle injuries, buried without royal ceremony. In Leicester, where Richard was said to have been taken after Bosworth. No single element was enough by itself. That is the strength of the case. It did not depend on one miraculous sign. It depended on convergence, different lines of evidence leaning toward the same answer from different directions. And yet, standing at the edge of that grave, before laboratory testing, before DNA results, before the public announcement, the remains were still not Richard III in the fullest sense. They were a candidate, a deeply compelling one, but still a candidate. That distinction may feel cold, but it is what keeps discovery honest. Because desire had entered the trench. Of course it had. How could it not? Everyone understood what the find might mean. The atmosphere around those bones must have been extraordinarily difficult to hold steady. Part scientific discipline, part historical disbelief, part human encounter. To uncover any skeleton is to intrude upon a person's final privacy. To uncover one that might belong to a lost king is to feel the pressure of an entire national story pressing down into a narrow strip of earth. But the skeleton itself was not dramatic in the way stories are dramatic. It did not care about Shakespeare. It did not know the Tudors. It did not argue about legitimacy. It simply lay where it had been placed, carrying in its structure and injuries the evidence of a life that had been transformed into myth after death. That silence gave it power. For centuries, Richard had been described by people with motives: enemies, supporters, chroniclers, playwrights, historians, enthusiasts. Each added interpretation. Each made choices. The skeleton offered something different. Not pure truth, because physical evidence also requires interpretation, but a kind of resistance. It could not flatter. It could not confess. It could not repeat Tudor propaganda or Ricardian defense. It could only present marks: a curved spine, wounds, a grave, a location. Those marks began to pull the story out of the realm of inherited certainty and back into contact with the material world. The choir setting added a final layer of meaning. In a medieval church, the choir was a significant space, associated with the religious life of the friary and the formal structure of worship. If Richard had been buried there, it suggested his body was not simply dumped anywhere, despite the lack of royal grandeur. There may have been some recognition of status, even in defeat. Humiliation and ritual could coexist. Political enemies could display a body, yet still allow burial in consecrated ground. History often lives in those contradictions. Richard was degraded, but not erased immediately. Buried, but not honored magnificently. Remembered in records, but lost in the city. Accused as a monster, but found as a human body with a real and specific condition. The skeleton in the choir did not simplify the story. It made the simplifications harder to maintain. There is a strange intimacy in imagining that moment of recognition beginning. Not the public spectacle that would follow, but the private dawning among those at the site. The possibility that this was not merely another medieval burial. The possibility that the search had not only found Greyfriars, but had reached the precise human center of the mystery. The possibility that beneath the plain ground of Leicester lay the last English king to die in battle, still carrying the marks of that final violence. The discovery asked for patience. It demanded tests, but it also changed the emotional weather of the investigation. Before the skeleton, the search had been brave, reasoned, and uncertain. After the skeleton, uncertainty remained, but it had acquired a shape. The lost king was no longer only somewhere beneath the modern city. He might be here, in this grave, in these bones, in the choir of the church that had vanished above him. And if that were true, then the most famous image of Richard III, the monster built by memory, was about to be brought face to face with the one witness no Tudor writer, no stage actor, and no later defender could completely control. The body itself. Chapter 15. Science meets the legend. Finding the skeleton was only the beginning. That may sound strange because the discovery itself had all the force of an ending. A lost friary had been located. A grave had been opened. A body had emerged with a curved spine, battle injuries, and a burial position that seemed to fit the dark little aftermath of Bosworth. For a moment, the story appeared almost ready to close. But archaeology is not allowed to end on atmosphere. The bones had to be tested. This is where Richard's story moved from the soil of Leicester into the colder light of the laboratory. The question was no longer simply whether the discovery felt right, or whether the pieces seemed to line up. Feeling has carried many historical mistakes a long way. The remains needed to be examined through multiple forms of evidence: osteology, radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, and the archaeological context of the grave itself. No single test could carry the whole burden. That is important. The identification of Richard III did not rest on one dramatic scientific flourish, as if a machine beeped and announced the name of a king. It was a cumulative case. Each line of inquiry had its own limits. Each could support, complicate, or weaken the interpretation. Only together could they turn possibility into confidence. The bones themselves offered the first kind of testimony. Osteological analysis could estimate sex, age, physical condition, and trauma. The skeleton was male. The age at death was consistent with Richard, who died in his early 30s. The spinal curvature was clear, and it matched a real medical condition rather than the grotesque exaggerations that later tradition had made famous. The injuries, especially those to the skull, were consistent with violent death, and the pattern made sense for a man killed in battle after losing protective equipment or being exposed in the final moments. The bones did not tell a clean story. Bones rarely do. They showed damage. They showed condition. They showed possibilities narrowed by expertise. But they did not recreate Bosworth in full. They did not show Richard's thoughts in the charge, or name each weapon, or tell us whether an injury came before death or just after, with the vivid clarity a narrator might wish for. Science did not replace historical judgment. It disciplined it. Radiocarbon dating added another piece. The remains had to belong to the right broad period. If the dating had placed the skeleton too early or too late, the case would have collapsed, no matter how tempting the other features seemed. A curved spine in the right location would still not make a medieval king if the body came from the wrong century. The dating helped anchor the remains in the proper historical window, placing the skeleton where the Richard hypothesis needed it to be. Then came the evidence that captured public imagination most strongly: DNA. DNA has a special authority in modern culture. People hear it and think of certainty. Identity reduced to a code, mystery solved by biology, old arguments swept aside by a laboratory result. But even DNA requires context. Samples must be handled carefully. Family lines must be traced. Contamination must be guarded against. The genetic signal has to be interpreted through genealogy, probability, and comparison. In Richard's case, researchers compared DNA from the remains with that of living individuals connected through family lines. The most significant comparisons involved maternal line descent, because mitochondrial DNA can be passed down through generations in a way useful for this kind of identification. The results supported the identification of the remains as Richard III. But even here, the story was not magically simple. Genealogies over centuries can contain surprises. Family trees drawn on paper do not always match biological descent at every point. Human history includes adoptions, misattributed paternity, undocumented relationships, and ordinary gaps in record-keeping. The scientists had to account for that. Their work did not make the past suddenly neat. It made the probability strong enough, when combined with the rest of the evidence, to support a remarkable conclusion. The skeleton was Richard III. What makes this moment so powerful is not merely that science named a body. It is that science entered a story already crowded with literature, propaganda, rumor, loyalty, and accusation. Richard had been argued over for centuries by people reading texts. Now his own remains became part of the archive. And the body did something texts had struggled to do. It corrected the scale. The spine confirmed that Richard had scoliosis, but not the monstrous deformity made famous in hostile imagination. This did not make the old stories entirely baseless, and that is precisely what makes the evidence interesting. There had been something physical for enemies to notice, remember, and distort. The body had given legend a seed. Politics and theater had grown it into a forest. The injuries also pulled Richard away from caricature. The body in the grave was not merely the villain of a play. It was a man who had died violently in combat. The wounds were not metaphors. They were physical marks left by a battlefield. They connected him to the final charge, to the collapse of his army, to the stripping away of royal protection, to the harsh treatment of a defeated king. Science did not absolve Richard. That must be said clearly. It did not solve the fate of the princes in the tower. It did not prove that he was a good ruler, a bad ruler, a murderer, or a victim of slander. It did not tell us whether he believed his own claim to the throne was lawful, or whether he used law as a weapon for ambition. It could not measure conscience. It could not test guilt. But it changed the conditions of the argument. Before the discovery, Richard could be treated almost entirely as a figure made of words, a chronicler's accusation, a Tudor necessity, a Shakespearean performance, a Ricardian defense. After the discovery, there was a body in the room, a body with limits, a body with a shape that could be studied rather than imagined, a body that made certain exaggerations harder to repeat honestly. This is the deeper meaning of the identification. Modern science did not tear the legend down in one glorious stroke. Legends are more durable than that. Instead, it forced the legend to share space with evidence. It said, "Here is the man's spine, not the stage version. Here are the wounds, not the moral symbol. Here is the burial, not the rumor of a body lost forever to the river. Here is a human being whose remains survived the very centuries that tried to turn him into something simpler." That is why the case reached beyond archaeology. It became a public lesson in how history works when different kinds of evidence meet. Texts preserve memory, but they can flatter power. Theater preserves feeling, but it can overwhelm fact. Bones preserve physical truth, but they cannot explain motive. DNA can identify, but not interpret. None is sufficient alone. Together, they create a more careful kind of knowledge. Richard III's rediscovery did not end the debate over his life. It made the debate more honest. The king beneath the parking lot was not the pure monster of Tudor imagination. He was not automatically the innocent victim imagined by his most devoted defenders. He was a real man, physically altered by scoliosis, violently killed, buried in the place some records had long suggested, and then transformed by centuries of political and artistic need. The legend had always been loud. The science was quieter. But once the tests were complete, the quiet evidence had done something extraordinary. It had reached across more than 500 years and returned a name to a skeleton, a body to a story, and a measure of reality to one of the most distorted reputations in English history. Chapter 16. The Man Behind the Myth. The skeleton did not give Richard III back his innocence. It gave him back his proportions. That may be the most honest way to understand what happened after the identification. For centuries, Richard had been made either larger or smaller than life. Larger as a monster, swollen by theater and hostile memory until he became the embodiment of crooked ambition. Smaller as a man, reduced to a few accusations, a few images, a few lines delivered on stage with delicious malice. The bones did not replace one extreme with another. They interrupted both. They showed a man with scoliosis, not the monstrous physical caricature that later imagination had treasured. They showed a man who had died violently, not a shadowy figure who existed only in plots and whispers. They showed a body buried in a real place, under real earth, subject to the same decay as anyone else. The discovery did not make Richard lovable. It made him harder to use carelessly. And that matters, because Richard III has often been less a person than a battlefield where other people fight about history. To his harshest critics, he is the usurper whose nephews disappeared, whose crown was taken through fear and manipulation, whose fall was deserved. To his most devoted defenders, he is the victim of Tudor propaganda, a capable ruler turned into a monster because the winners needed him monstrous. Both versions contain temptations. The villain version is satisfying because it organizes the chaos. It gives the Wars of the Roses a final dark figure, a man whose defeat feels like moral housekeeping. The heroic victim version is satisfying because it offers rescue. It lets us feel cleverer than the old propaganda, more generous than Shakespeare, more willing to see the human being beneath the painted mask. But history is often least honest when it becomes most satisfying. The real Richard lived in the difficult middle. He was a younger brother shaped by dynastic violence, a loyal supporter of Edward IV, a powerful northern lord, a man with military experience and political intelligence, a ruler whose accession remains deeply troubling, a king under whose authority two royal children disappeared from public view, a battlefield commander who died with physical courage, a defeated monarch whose reputation was then handled by his enemies. None of those facts cancels the others. This is where the skeleton becomes more than an archaeological find. It becomes a discipline for the imagination. The body forces us to stop treating Richard as pure symbol. Scoliosis becomes scoliosis again, a medical condition, not a moral verdict. Battle wounds become injuries, not dramatic punctuation. The grave becomes a burial, not merely a metaphor. Evidence pulls the story downward, away from the stage lights and back toward the earth. Yet bones have their own limits. They cannot tell us what Richard ordered in 1483. They cannot answer the question of the princes in the tower. They cannot reveal whether he believed the illegitimacy claim against Edward IV's children or used it because it opened the way to power. They cannot tell us how much fear, ambition, duty, resentment, or calculation moved through his mind as the crisis unfolded. A skeleton can correct a lie about a body, It cannot read a conscience. That is why the rediscovery should not be treated as a verdict. It is not a royal pardon issued by science. It is not a condemnation either. It is something more subtle. A reminder that the argument must be conducted at human scale. The most important correction may be the physical one. Richard's spinal curvature was real, but it would not have made him the grotesque creature of later depiction. This changes the emotional architecture of the legend. For centuries, audiences were invited to connect outward form with inward corruption. His body was made to accuse him before any evidence was heard. The skeleton breaks that connection. It says, in effect, that a body can be different without being a confession. That is a quiet but serious moral correction. It also changes how we hear the older descriptions. Some may preserve observations distorted by hostility. Others may reflect the habits of an age that was willing to turn disability into omen. The discovery does not prove that every hostile writer fabricated Richard's appearance. It suggests something more believable and more uncomfortable. That a real condition was noticed, exaggerated, and then made to serve a political story. The man became a lesson written onto his own back. Modern viewers may congratulate themselves for seeing through that cruelty, but we should be cautious. Every age has its own shortcuts for turning people into symbols. Richard's story survives because the habit is not medieval. It is human. We still prefer visible signs. We still like our villains recognizable. We still confuse narrative neatness with truth. The skeleton also complicates the heroic rescue of Richard. It is easy, after seeing how unfair the caricature was, to want the whole case against him to collapse. But that would be another misuse of evidence. The fact that his body was slandered does not mean his actions were pure. The fact that Tudor writers benefited from blackening his name does not mean every suspicion was false. The princes did disappear. Richard did take the crown in a moment when their position was being dismantled. His reign did begin under a cloud that cannot be explained away by pointing to Shakespeare's exaggerations. A false portrait can hang over a real crime, or over a crime not yet proven, or over a political catastrophe for which responsibility is shared, but never evenly. The difficulty is staying with uncertainty without turning it into fog. We know enough to doubt the monster. We do not know enough to declare the saint. What remains is more interesting. A capable, controversial, physically real, politically dangerous man whose life was consumed by a system that rewarded ruthlessness and then condemned the loser for practicing it badly. Richard was not outside the violence of his age. He belonged to it. That may be the hardest thing to accept, because it denies us the comfort of exception. If Richard is only a monster, the rest of the world around him looks cleaner. If he is only a victim, the moral burden shifts conveniently onto propaganda. But if he is a man of his time, intelligent, loyal, ambitious, pious perhaps, ruthless certainly when politics demanded it, and trapped within the brutal logic of royal blood, then the story becomes wider than one king. It becomes a story about how power deforms memory, not just bodies. Memory. The body found in Leicester had been altered by disease, injury, burial, and time. The memory of Richard had been altered by defeat, dynasty, writing, theater, nationalism, and the human appetite for a good villain. Both forms of alteration had to be studied carefully, one by osteologists and geneticists, the other by historians, readers, and viewers willing to distrust a story that comes too smoothly. In the end, The man behind the myth is not fully recoverable. No excavation can restore his voice as it sounded in private. No test can uncover the exact balance of fear and ambition behind his decisions. No careful reassessment can return the princes or undo Bosworth. The past does not give itself back whole, even when bones survive, but it can give back enough to disturb us. Richard's rediscovery asks us to look again, not so we can settle into a new certainty, but so we can become less obedient to old ones. The skeleton beneath the parking lot did not tell the world, "You were wrong about everything." It said something quieter and more demanding. "You have been looking at a story. Now look at a man." Chapter 17, A King Reburied. When Richard III was found, the question changed. For centuries, people had asked where he was. Once the skeleton had been identified, that old uncertainty gave way to a more delicate problem. What should be done with him now? A body can be evidence. It can be a scientific subject. It can be a historical revelation, but it is also human remains, and in Richard's case, royal remains. The discovery beneath the Leicester parking lot did not end with laboratory results or press photographs. It led to ceremony, argument, law, local pride, national attention, and something that looked, from a distance, almost like a second funeral after 500 years of delay. The debate over reburial was not a small matter of logistics. It touched the emotional nerve of the entire story. Richard had been killed at Bosworth, displayed in defeat, buried without the lasting royal monument his rank might have commanded, then lost beneath the changing city. To decide where he should be reburied was to decide, symbolically, what kind of figure he had become after rediscovery. Was he Leicester's king, because Leicester had held him in the earth all along? Was he York's king, because his deepest political identity had been tied to the North and to the House of York? Was he a national figure who belonged somewhere more obviously royal, more grand, more distant from the parking lot where modern chance had preserved him? These were not only practical questions, they were questions about possession. And possession is never simple when history has been wounded. Leicester had a powerful claim of continuity. Richard had been brought there after Bosworth. He had been buried there at Greyfriars. The city had not honored him knowingly across the centuries, but unknowingly, it had kept him. That strange fact gave Leicester's claim a quiet force. The city was not merely the place of discovery. It was the place where the last chapter of his physical story had actually unfolded. York's claim was different, and also emotionally strong. Richard had ruled in the north. He had cultivated loyalty there. He was associated with Yorkist identity in a way that made many feel he belonged more naturally to that region than to the city where his defeated corpse had been taken. To supporters who viewed him as a maligned king, reburial in Leicester could feel like leaving him in the geography of humiliation rather than returning him to the landscape of loyalty. Both arguments reveal something important. Richard's rediscovery did not produce a single national feeling. It reopened old attachments. For some, he remained a suspect king whose burial deserved dignity but not romantic exaggeration. For others, he was a wronged monarch finally emerging from Tudor darkness. For many more, he was something in between, a historical figure whose story had become unexpectedly intimate because bones had made him real again. The public response showed how deeply a medieval king could still disturb the modern imagination. Crowds gathered. News followed every development. The face reconstructed from the skull appeared across media, giving viewers a version of Richard that was neither Shakespeare's villain nor a royal portrait polished by power. It was a face made from bone and probability, strangely calm, almost ordinary. That ordinariness mattered. It gave people someone to look at, not merely someone to argue about. Reburial turned identification into ritual. Science had named him. Ceremony had to receive him. There is a difference between knowing where a body is and acknowledging what that body represents. The excavation had treated Richard as evidence because it had to. The reinterment treated him as a person because, after all the tests and debates, that was also what he was. A controversial person, certainly. A king whose reign cannot be purified by sympathy, but still a human being who had died violently and whose remains had spent centuries without a known grave. The eventual reinterment in Leicester Cathedral gave Richard something he had been denied after Bosworth: public dignity. Not victory, not acquittal. Dignity. That distinction is worth holding. A dignified burial does not require us to settle every question in Richard's favor. It does not erase the princes in the tower. It does not undo the violence of his rise or the suspicion that clung to his crown. It does not declare that Tudor history was wholly false or that Shakespeare must be banished from memory. It simply says that the dead should not remain forever trapped inside the politics of their defeat. For Richard, that was no small restoration. After Bosworth, his body had been used to prove that he was finished. In Leicester Cathedral, his body was used differently, to invite reflection on how the finished can return. The ceremony did not make him a saint. It made him visible again in a more human register. The king who had been displayed as a warning was now displayed as a historical presence, mourned by some, studied by many, and watched by a public aware that something unusual had occurred. A lost monarch had come back into the civic and national story. The reburial also changed Leicester itself. The city became tied to Richard in a new way, not through vague local memory, but through archaeological fact and public ritual. The parking lot was no longer just a curious discovery site. It had become part of a larger landscape of remembrance. The ordinary ground had yielded a royal body, and the city had to decide how to live with that knowledge. That is one of the quieter consequences of rediscovery. Places are changed by what they are found to contain. A street, a car park, a church, a trench, all can be rearranged in the imagination once the past breaks through. People may still go to work, eat lunch, argue about traffic, and forget to look closely at the pavement. But the story has entered the place. Leicester now holds Richard not by accident, but by recognition. There is something deeply fitting in the fact that his final resting place became neither a triumphant royal mausoleum nor a hidden grave. It became a cathedral tomb in the city that had both displayed and buried him, lost and recovered him. The arc is not perfectly redemptive. History rarely offers that, but it is balanced in a way that feels unusually precise. Humiliation, loss, rediscovery, ceremony. The same city that once received him as a defeated corpse eventually received him as a king to be reburied with care. And yet, even that care could not make him simple. Visitors could stand near the tomb and still disagree about the man. They could see him as victim, usurper, soldier, uncle, king, propaganda's casualty, or all of these uneasily at once. The tomb does not demand one conclusion. Its power lies partly in refusing to close the argument. It gives the debate a place to gather without pretending the debate is over. That may be the most honest memorial Richard could have. Not a monument to innocence, not a monument to guilt, a monument to the difficulty of knowing a man buried beneath 5 centuries of politics, literature, loyalty, fear, and fascination. The reburial gave Richard III a ceremony his first burial never could. It returned him to public attention not as the monster of the stage, and not as the flawless king of modern defense, but as a damaged, ambitious, brave, accused, defeated, rediscovered human being. A man whose bones had outlasted his enemies, his defenders, his dynasty, and even the friary that first received him. In the end, Leicester did not give Richard back his kingdom. It gave him a grave that could be found, and after everything that had been done to his memory, that was a kind of justice history could actually provide. Chapter 18, What the Ground Remembered. For more than 5 centuries, Richard III existed in pieces, a name in chronicles, a villain on stage, a disputed king in history books, a rumor beneath Leicester, a body no one could point to with certainty. Then the ground answered, not completely. The ground never gives everything back. It did not explain the disappearance of the princes in the tower. It did not reveal Richard's private motives or settle the moral argument around his crown. It did not tell us whether he saw himself as a savior of Yorkist stability, a lawful heir, or a man doing what power required before someone else did it first. But it remembered what people had lost. It remembered Greyfriars when the friary had disappeared. It remembered the grave when maps had become uncertain. It remembered the body when the body had been turned into character, symbol, warning, joke, accusation, and myth. Beneath asphalt and painted lines, beneath the ordinary habits of a working city, there remained a quieter record than the one written by victors. That is the real force of Richard's rediscovery. It does not ask us to abandon written history. Without records, no one would have known where to search. Without chronicles, maps, and old claims, the excavation would have had no direction. But it does warn us not to confuse the loudest story with the whole truth. The past is often preserved unevenly. A royal reputation may be distorted beyond recognition, while a fragile skeleton survives almost exactly where it was placed. There is something humbling in that. The Tudors won the throne, and for a long time they won the story. Shakespeare gave Richard a voice so memorable that it nearly drowned out the man. Generations inherited a king already shaped for them, crooked, murderous, brilliant, damned. Later defenders tried to pull him back in the opposite direction, sometimes with equal certainty. But the bones found in Leicester refused both kinds of simplicity. They showed a real spinal condition, not a monster's body. They showed a violent death, not a theatrical exit. They showed a burial in a vanished church, not a legend washed away by the river. They showed, above all, that even a king can be reduced by memory until the earth becomes the more careful historian. Richard III remains difficult. He should remain difficult. Any version of him that feels too easy is probably serving someone's need. The need for a villain, the need for a victim, the need for a clean ending to a civil war that was never clean. His reign was born in suspicion. His nephews vanished. His enemies gathered. He died fighting hard for a crown that many believed he had no right to wear. And still, he was human. That may sound like a modest conclusion after so much mystery, but it is not. To restore humanity to a figure buried under centuries of performance is not to excuse him. It is to make judgment more serious. Monsters can be dismissed. Humans must be understood before they are condemned, defended, or remembered. The parking lot in Leicester became famous because it seemed absurd. A medieval king beneath a place made for cars. But perhaps that absurdity is what made the discovery so honest. History is not always waiting inside grand ruins or behind museum glass. Sometimes it lies under a space we cross without thinking, beneath the surface of an ordinary day, held in place by accident until curiosity breaks the seal. Richard vanished because power changed hands. Buildings fell, stories hardened, and a city kept living above him. He returned because someone asked whether the old record might still be true, and that is where the story leaves us. Not with every mystery solved, but with a deeper caution about certainty. The past can be buried. It can be misused. It can be staged so convincingly that generations mistake the performance for the person. Yet sometimes, against all expectation, it can also be recovered. Not whole, not pure, but enough to make us look again. Beneath the asphalt, the king had waited without crown, without voice, without defense. And when the ground finally opened, it did not give back a legend, it gave back a man.